January 18, 1945. Western Europe. Night presses down on the forest like a weight. Snow absorbs the sound of footsteps, but it cannot hide the war. Somewhere ahead, artillery thumps, slow, deliberate, methodical. Each concussion rolls through frozen ground and into bone. American infantry lie scattered along a shallow ridgeline. Some are silent. Some are breathing too fast. Some are calling out, not for orders, but for help. Unarmed figures move forward anyway. They wear white armbands marked with red crosses, already darkened by mud and blood. They kneel where bullets still snap through branches. They cut away frozen fabric. They work by touch more than sight. From a tree several hundred yards away, German officers observe through field glasses. They do not fire, not yet. They watch. To them, it looks careless, exposed, almost naive. In the German army, the wounded wait until the fighting passes. In the German army, medics move when the battlefield allows it. This rush into open fire seems theatrical, wasteful. One officer lowers his binoculars. Another smirks. Men like this, they think, will not last the night. But the night stretches on. Hours later, stretchers move back down the slope. Not empty, not silent. Men who should be dead are still breathing. Men with chest wounds are alive. Men with shattered legs are conscious. By morning, something uncomfortable lingers among the observers. Not admiration. Not yet. Doubt. And doubt, in war, is the first crack in certainty. A crack that will widen when the wounded begin to speak, and what they say cannot be ignored. By the winter of 1944, the German army was no stranger to mass casualties. It had been living with them for more than 5 years. From Poland to France, from the Balkans to the vast killing fields of the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had learned to fight long wars with limited mercy. Its medical doctrine reflected that reality. German battlefield medicine was structured, hierarchical, and rigid. Treatment followed rank, unit priority, and availability. Wounded men were expected to endure until conditions allowed evacuation. Pain was not a crisis. It was a condition of service. This philosophy was not born of cruelty. It was inherited. During the First World War, German medical officers had faced casualty rates so overwhelming that rapid treatment for all was impossible. The lesson absorbed between 1914 and 1918 was brutal but clear. Resources must be conserved, and survival could not be promised. By the Second World War, this thinking was institutionalized. German medics operated close to the front, but movement under active fire was discouraged. Aid stations were placed deliberately behind cover. Evacuation was sequential and slow. A man wounded in the open often waited until nightfall, or longer. Morphine was scarce. Blood transfusion was limited. Antibiotics, especially penicillin, were largely unavailable. Surgery was delayed until transport permitted. For German commanders, this was not negligence. It was realism. On the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to -30°C and battles consumed entire divisions in days, saving every wounded man was neither feasible nor expected. Medical officers adapted by prioritizing those most likely to return to duty. Those who could not walk, who bled too heavily, or who required prolonged care were often classified as transportfähig only when circumstances allowed. Some never were. This approach shaped attitudes. German officers viewed the battlefield as a place where survival depended on discipline, not intervention. A soldier who fell in open ground was unlucky. A medic who rushed forward under fire was reckless. There was also a cultural undercurrent. The German military tradition emphasized stoicism. Endurance was valorized. Pain was endured in silence. To cry out for aid was weakness. Medical care existed to preserve fighting strength, not individual life. The unit came first. The army second. The man last. By 1944, this worldview had hardened. Years of attrition had stripped away illusion. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. Fuel was scarce. Vehicles were lost. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Field medical units were stretched thin, often operating without electricity, heat, or sufficient supplies. Doctors made impossible decisions daily. Who might live? Who would almost certainly die? And so, when German officers along the Western Front observed American medics moving immediately into fire, their reaction was shaped by everything they had learned. It looked like ignorance, like inexperience, like a nation new to war and unprepared for its cost. They assumed the Americans would learn quickly. They assumed the bodies would pile up. They assumed survival rates would match reality. What they did not yet understand was that the Americans were not ignoring reality. They were redefining it. And that redefinition had been years in the making, across an ocean, in classrooms, training fields, and doctrine manuals that approached battlefield medicine in a fundamentally different way. The American approach to battlefield medicine did not emerge by accident. It was built deliberately, slowly, and with painful memory. In 1918, the United States had entered the First World War late and unprepared. Medical units were understaffed. Evacuation chains were improvised. Thousands of men who survived their initial wounds died from shock, infection, or exposure. The lesson endured. Between the wars, U.S. Army planners studied casualty reports with clinical detachment. They noted a pattern that cut through all fronts and all units. Men who received treatment within the first hour after wounding survived at dramatically higher rates. Time, not bravery, was the decisive factor. By 1941, this insight shaped doctrine. The U.S. Army reorganized its medical corps around speed. Not comfort, not perfection, speed. Combat medics were trained not as doctors, but as immediate responders. They were taught hemorrhage control, airway management, and shock prevention. They carried morphine syrettes for pain, plasma for volume replacement, sulfa powder for infection control, and bandages designed for rapid application. Most importantly, they were trained to move forward. American medics were instructed to reach the wounded where they fell, if at all possible. This was not heroism. It was calculation. Every minute spent bleeding in the cold reduced survival odds. Every delay compounded shock. Every untreated wound multiplied infection risk. The doctrine accepted risk to the medic in exchange for survival of the wounded. It was controversial. Some American officers worried the policy would waste trained personnel. Others argued that unarmed medics moving under fire violated practical battlefield sense, if not the spirit of the Geneva Convention. But U.S. Army Medical Department leadership persisted. They reorganized the evacuation chain into layers. Frontline aid stations were positioned closer to combat units than ever before. Casualties moved rapidly from foxhole to aid station, then to collecting stations, field hospitals, and evacuation hospitals. Vehicles were dedicated to this purpose. Jeeps were modified to carry stretchers. Ambulances were marked and prioritized on supply routes. Aircraft were increasingly used for evacuation when airfields allowed. Technology reinforced the system. By 1943, American forces had access to penicillin in quantities no other army could match. Blood plasma was produced industrially and shipped overseas in massive volumes. Surgical teams were mobile, able to operate close to the front within hours of an engagement. The effect was measurable. In the First World War, roughly 1 in 5 American soldiers wounded in action died. By 1944, that number had dropped to approximately 1 in 25. German intelligence noticed the statistics but misunderstood the cause. They attributed survival rates to lighter fighting or inflated reporting. They believed American troops simply faced fewer hardships. What they could not see from reports alone was the human mechanism behind the numbers, the relentless urgency of American medical response. To German observers, this urgency looked chaotic. Medics moved before firing stopped. They treated enemy wounded without hesitation. They evacuated men who, by German standards, would have been left until nightfall or later. It appeared inefficient, overly sentimental, almost civilian. But in practice, it changed the battlefield in subtle ways. American units retained manpower longer. Wounded soldiers returned to duty faster. Morale held under sustained fire because men believed, correctly, that if they fell, someone would come. This belief mattered. By late 1944, as American and German forces collided across France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, two philosophies met face to face. One accepted loss as inevitable. The other refused it whenever possible. The difference would not become fully visible in reports or statistics. It would reveal itself in moments of chaos. When blood soaked into frozen ground. When stretchers crossed enemy lines. And when wounded men survived long enough to remember who saved them. Those moments would soon converge, forcing both sides to confront what they were witnessing. And the confrontation would come not in daylight, but in darkness. Angles, Section 1 Angle 1. The human presence under fire. The American combat medic was not trained to fight. He carried no rifle, no submachine gun, often no helmet. What he carried instead was weight, bandages, plasma, morphine, scissors, sulfa powder, tools meant for hands that shook in the cold and dark. On the Western Front, medics were attached directly to infantry platoons. They slept where the riflemen slept. They moved when the riflemen moved. When the shooting began, they waited just long enough to locate the sound of pain. Then they went forward. This closeness forged something rare in war: trust. American soldiers watched medics crawl through shellfire to reach them. They felt hands pressed down on wounds, voices steady and close. They learned that falling did not mean abandonment. German soldiers noticed this too. From captured positions and observation points, they saw medics step into open ground without orders shouted or weapons raised. They saw them kneel beside wounded men without checking insignia. To German eyes, this was unsettling. A man without a weapon was a liability. A man who ignored cover was a fool. A man who treated enemy wounded violated ingrained hierarchy. And yet, the medic returned, again and again. Not all survived. Medics suffered casualty rates comparable to frontline infantry. Some units reported losses exceeding 30% during prolonged engagements. Their Red Crosses did not stop bullets. In close combat, markings were obscured by mud and snow. But the survivors left an impression that no intelligence summary could capture. They were not reckless. They were deliberate. And deliberate action under fire signaled a belief that the life on the ground mattered enough to risk another. That belief was noticed. Angle 2. Tactical impact beyond the wound. From a purely military perspective, battlefield medicine altered combat endurance. German doctrine accepted a steady drain of manpower. American doctrine fought it. When wounded men returned to their units days or weeks later, cohesion held. Squads retained experience. Platoons remembered how to move together. This was not mercy, it was force preservation. American commanders observed that units with rapid medical evacuation broke less often under pressure. Fear was not eliminated, but it was contained. Men fought differently when they believed they would be treated if hit. German officers watching from across the lines saw something unfamiliar. American positions did not thin as expected. Casualties occurred, but units remained functional. This contradicted long-held assumptions. In the German system, heavy fighting meant permanent loss. In the American system, heavy fighting often meant temporary absence. The battlefield rhythm shifted. German planners could not easily calculate attrition when men did not disappear permanently. American casualty lists did not translate directly into weakened formations. The medic, unseen on most maps, quietly altered tactical equations. And that alteration unsettled those trained to read war through numbers alone. Angle 3. Enemy observation and misjudgment. German officers were trained observers. They cataloged enemy behavior with precision. They noted American supply abundance, vehicle density, and air superiority. Medical behavior, at first, was dismissed. It was categorized as excess, an indulgence of an industrial power with resources to waste. But repeated observation challenged that dismissal. Men who should have died were seen again. American wounded captured days later were stabilized, clean, and conscious. German wounded treated by Americans survived injuries that, in German hospitals, often proved fatal. Reports filtered upward. Some were skeptical. Others were quietly disturbed. How could an army afford this pace? How could it sustain such exposure? The answer had not yet fully formed. But by the end of 1944, German officers along the Western Front understood one thing. They were not merely fighting American firepower. They were fighting an American system. One that reached into the mud, the snow, and the blood, and refused to let go. That realization did not come all at once. It would crystallize under specific conditions. When observation turned into proximity, when wounded men crossed lines, and when survival itself became testimony. Those conditions were approaching. Angles, Section 2 Angle 4. Technology as a silent weapon. On the battlefield, technology is often measured in guns and armor. But some of the most decisive tools of the war were carried in canvas bags. American medics arrived in Europe with resources unmatched by any army in history. Not in theory, in volume. Blood plasma was produced in factories, freeze-dried, packaged, and shipped across the Atlantic by the ton. It could be reconstituted in minutes and administered near the front. For men bleeding into frozen soil, this meant the difference between collapse and consciousness. Penicillin followed soon after. By late 1944, American field hospitals routinely administered antibiotics that German doctors could only ration, if they had them at all. Infections that once guaranteed death became survivable complications. German medical officers understood the science. They lacked the supply. As American medics stabilized men close to the fighting, mobile surgical units operated within hours. Operations that once required long transport now occurred miles from the front. To German observers, this looked impossible. Medicine, in their experience, moved backward from the front. Here, it advanced forward. The effect compounded. Fewer men died from shock. Fewer succumbed to infection. Survival was no longer rare, it was expected. Technology did not replace courage. It amplified it. And on frozen nights, its effects were visible in the men who lived. Angle 5, Leadership and Doctrine. This system did not exist without command endorsement. American senior leadership viewed manpower as a renewable but precious resource. Industry could replace tanks. Factories could replace aircraft. Experienced soldiers could not be manufactured on demand. Medical doctrine reflected that understanding. Orders emphasized immediate care. Evacuation routes were planned alongside supply routes. Medical units received transport priority, rivaling ammunition. This was not charity. It was strategy. German leadership, constrained by dwindling resources, increasingly viewed medical care as a holding action. By late 1944, German hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and undersupplied. Evacuation trains were bombed. Field hospitals were overrun or abandoned. Doctors worked knowing outcomes they could not change. Against this backdrop, American medical leadership appeared almost defiant. A refusal to surrender to attrition. That refusal impressed some German officers deeply enough to be remembered long after the war ended. Angle 6, Moral Collision. Perhaps the most unsettling angle was not technical or tactical. It was moral. American medics treated wounded enemy soldiers without hesitation. This was doctrine. It was also practice. German wounded captured during engagements received the same bandages, plasma, and care as Americans. For many, it was the first time they experienced immediate treatment under fire. Some expected interrogation. Others expected neglect. Instead, they received care. This created an unintended consequence. German soldiers survived long enough to see the American medical system from inside. They spoke to each other. They compared experiences. Stories circulated quietly, of pain relieved, of lives preserved, of treatment without cruelty. For officers raised on rigid hierarchy, this was destabilizing. War depended on distance, between enemy and ally, between suffering and survival. American medical practice collapsed that distance. The battlefield was no longer just a place of destruction. It became, briefly and selectively, a place of preservation. These 6 angles did not exist in isolation. They converged under specific circumstances. When fire intensified, when casualties mounted, and when observation turned into encounter. That convergence would occur on a single night, under conditions where theory gave way to reality. And when it did, the wounded would speak, not with words at first, but with survival itself. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A night darker than the heart of winter itself. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, muffling movement. The German offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, had broken through American lines. Chaos stretched across miles of forested ridges and frozen roads. Amid the smoke and gunfire, American medics moved forward. They went where the fighting was heaviest, where bullets skipped over frozen soil and shattered trees. They knelt beside men bleeding from shrapnel, rifle fire, and frostbite alike. They worked quickly, methodically, unarmed, yet unflinching. One medic, Private First Class Thomas E. Larkin, had been advancing with a rifle platoon when an artillery shell buried itself 20 feet away. Shrapnel tore through his comrade's leg. Without hesitation, Larkin dropped his pack, applied a tourniquet, and dragged the man to relative cover. Minutes later, he moved toward another call, ignoring the distant rumble of enemy mortars. Across the line, German officers observed through sparse light from flares and distant fires. They noted the pattern. Wounded men who should have remained silent, or worse, dead, were being carried back. Men who had collapsed in frozen mud were rising again. Casualties seemed to vanish, only to reappear days later in positions still able to fight. At a command post near St. Vith, a battalion leader jotted notes. American medics operate under fire. Lives preserved against all expectation. Unknown doctrine. Elsewhere, a small field hospital received the first wave of wounded Germans captured during counterattacks. They were treated identically to Americans. Wounds cleaned, blood plasma administered, morphine given where necessary. Doctors noted that survival odds for these men far exceeded their prior experience. This night stretched into morning, the tension never easing. The Germans had anticipated carnage. They expected suffering to accumulate, morale to crumble. Instead, the Americans created a paradox, a battlefield of destruction and preservation simultaneously. Word traveled quickly. Medics became visible, almost legendary, in whispered reports. The wounded began to speak, not yet to their captors, not yet in formal statements, but in the language of endurance. Survivors shared their experience across units. They described hands pressing on wounds, voices giving instructions, eyes that met theirs with calm certainty, not alarm. German soldiers, listening, began to question assumptions long held. Could a human life be treated as a tactical asset without endangering the army itself? Could the wounded actually survive, and in doing so, return to fight again? This was no abstract principle. It was happening before them, in the mud, the snow, the firelight, and the darkness. And it culminated in a series of encounters where American medics, treating both friend and foe, created a battlefield paradox the Germans could not rationalize. Those encounters would force a reevaluation of doctrine, morale, and expectations. Because nothing was more persuasive than a soldier who should have been dead, speaking with the evidence of survival. By the second night of the Ardennes offensive, the full effect of American medical doctrine became undeniable. Wounded men, once assumed lost, began to speak, not just to medics, but to German officers and fellow prisoners. Their testimony was raw, unplanned, and impossible to ignore. Private Heinrich Müller of the 5th Panzer Division was captured after being shelled in a clearing near Bastogne. Expecting rough treatment or abandonment, he was instead tended to immediately by an American medic. Blood loss was controlled, frostbite treated, morphine administered. Within 2 days, he could sit upright. Within a week, he was walking with crutches. In the command tent, German officers exchanged uneasy glances. Reports of prisoners recovering quickly reached headquarters. This defied decades of their own battlefield experience. Across the front line, similar stories emerged. Men who had suffered shattered legs, punctured lungs, and deep shrapnel wounds were alive and coherent. Even more startling, some returned to their units after recovery, in cases where the Germans expected permanent loss. American medics were unarmed, yet their presence altered tactical outcomes. Squads holding positions under extreme pressure maintained cohesion because soldiers believed in immediate care. Casualties did not accumulate in the expected numbers, leaving German commanders struggling to calculate attrition or plan attacks. The culmination of this came during a particularly brutal engagement near the town of Houffalize. A small American forward observation post was surrounded by a German patrol. 2 medics moved forward to extract the wounded under heavy machine gun fire. They worked in the open for nearly 20 minutes, stabilizing men with multiple gunshot wounds. When they returned with stretchers, German soldiers watching from the treeline were forced to recognize what they had seen. The wounded were alive because of these unarmed men. Interrogations and informal discussions followed. Prisoners reported survival, and officers took note. American medicine was not incidental. It was a force multiplier. In reports later filed by German staff, one line appears repeatedly. They saved men who should have been dead. This recognition reshaped German perception. Laughter turned to disbelief. Disbelief edged toward respect. And respect, in the context of war, was dangerous. It meant reevaluating assumptions about how the enemy fought and survived. By the end of the Ardennes offensive, the paradox was clear. American medics had not fired a single shot in many of these encounters, Yet their actions directly influenced the battlefield. They preserved life, altered morale, and demonstrated that survival could be a weapon in itself. The night the wounded spoke was not a single moment. It was a series of converging truths. The human, tactical, technological, and moral elements observed for weeks culminated in undeniable evidence. The American medical system worked, even in the face of extreme danger. And for German officers who had once laughed at the audacity of unarmed medics, there was no laughter left. Only an uncomfortable, reluctant recognition that some battles were won not by guns, but by hands that refused to leave the fallen behind. The Ardennes winter receded, leaving frozen fields littered with the remnants of battle. Bodies, spent ammunition, and torn equipment marked the terrain, but among them, survival rates told a different story. American statistics from the offensive reveal the tangible effect of their medical system. Infantry units that operated with frontline medics lost fewer men permanently. For every 25 wounded soldiers, roughly 24 survived to return to duty, a dramatic improvement over prior engagements. In contrast, German casualty recovery rates remained lower, constrained by both doctrine and dwindling resources. The human element was equally striking. Captured German soldiers, some with severe injuries, were treated identically to Americans. Field reports later cited multiple cases where German POWs, stabilized quickly and given morphine or plasma, returned to health in weeks instead of months. These experiences spread quietly among German units. Through whispered reports and letters to command, officers recorded observations of medics moving recklessly under fire, saving lives they had assumed were lost. The psychological effect was profound. American soldiers internalized a belief that injury did not equal death. This bolstered morale, encouraged perseverance under fire, and reinforced trust in the medic system. For the Germans, the opposite occurred. What was once dismissed as folly became a source of unease. If the enemy could preserve life so efficiently, attrition calculations, the backbone of military planning, were suddenly unreliable. Beyond immediate survival, the presence of medics influenced tactical behavior. Units could sustain longer engagements, advance under fire with confidence, and take calculated risks. Medics had become, in effect, a force multiplier, not through weaponry, but through preservation of manpower. Field hospitals, aid stations, and evacuation chains operated with speed and precision. Plasma, penicillin, and surgical care delivered close to the front amplified the human factor. Men who might have died from blood loss, infection, or shock were returned to fighting capability within days. The disparity did not go unnoticed in post-battle analyses. German medical officers documented anomalies in survival rates, attributing them initially to luck or propaganda. Over time, however, repeated encounters proved these assumptions false. American doctrine worked, and it challenged deeply ingrained German beliefs about how war must be fought. The night the wounded spoke had immediate tactical consequences, but its influence extended beyond any single engagement. It forced a confrontation with efficiency, humanity, and the strategic value of life itself. The long-term consequences of these encounters extended far beyond the Ardennes. In Germany, medical officers who survived the war would recall the shock of witnessing American medics in action. They remembered men pulled from frozen fields, stabilized in minutes, and returned to combat within weeks. Reports filed during the war, some captured by Allied intelligence, highlighted the extraordinary survival rates and the systematic approach behind them. For many officers, these observations challenged decades of entrenched doctrine. That loss was inevitable, and that frontline evacuation under fire was reckless. In the U.S., the experiences reinforced a commitment to rapid, forward medical care. Field manuals were updated. Medics received additional training. Evacuation chains were refined. The war demonstrated that medical care was not merely a humanitarian obligation. It was a tactical asset. Every life saved preserved experience, morale, and operational capability. Lessons carried forward into post-war military doctrine. NATO planning in the 1950s incorporated rapid casualty treatment as a strategic imperative. Mobile surgical units, blood plasma logistics, and medevac procedures owed much to the practices refined during the European campaigns. Even in modern conflicts, The principle endures. Speed and efficiency in medical response can determine both survival and mission success. For the soldiers themselves, the human stories endured. American medics were remembered not only for skill, but for courage. Unarmed, often under fire, they advanced into chaos to stabilize comrades and enemies alike. Their actions became part of the collective memory of the units they served with, stories passed down in memoirs, after-action reports, and oral histories. German officers who witnessed or recorded these events carried a complex legacy. Some retained resentment at the audacity of American medical practice. Others acknowledged, privately, that they had underestimated a doctrine that combined science, courage, and logistics in a way they had never seen before. Laughter at reckless bravery gave way to grudging respect. The battlefield had forced them to witness a new form of power, preservation itself. In the aftermath, the contrast was undeniable. Where one army accepted death as inevitable, another sought to challenge it at every opportunity. The American approach did not eliminate suffering, but it transformed it, turning moments of tragedy into acts of survival that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. By the time the snow melted from the Ardennes and the war moved into Germany, one truth was evident. The wounded had spoken, and their survival reshaped perceptions, doctrines, and the very nature of modern warfare. War is often measured in weapons and territory, in victories and losses. Yet in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, another measure emerged, the survival of the wounded. The night the wounded spoke revealed a truth that cannot be captured in statistics alone. It demonstrated that courage need not be armed, that technology need not fire a shot, and that humanity, applied with skill and urgency, could alter the course of battle. American medics embodied a philosophy that challenged both convention and expectation. By valuing life as a tactical asset, they preserved not just soldiers, but experience, morale, and cohesion. They transformed survival into strategy, and survival, in turn, became a weapon. For German officers who laughed at the audacity of these unarmed men, the lesson was stark. Assumptions about the enemy, however deeply held, could be shattered by simple acts of resolve. The battlefield had become a classroom, and the teacher was a man carrying a bag of bandages, plasma, and hope. This moment also resonates beyond military history. It is a reminder that innovation is not always measured in destruction, and courage is not always wielded as a blade. Sometimes, it is measured in the hands that reach into the chaos to lift a life, in the calm voice that refuses to abandon the fallen, and in the quiet insistence that survival matters. In the end, the Ardennes winter was not just a battlefield of fire and steel. It was a battlefield of humanity, and the voices of the wounded, alive, speaking, surviving, changed the way war was understood. They proved that even amidst the worst of violence, preservation could triumph. That sometimes, the most profound power lies not in the weapons we carry, but in the lives we refuse to leave behind.